Good afternoon and most welcome to 1123. Today I will propose something pretty marvelous, and it's the first attempt to put the concepts of thea and aletheia into scientific language. I think many people who read Heidegger finds aletheia and thea interesting, they admire it, but they lack the ability to put it into something real. And I think actually, if you can't put it into something scientifically real, you will see thea and aletheia just as metaphors for the Parmenidean stability. They become metaphorical. And I think that's a shame, and I will try to fix that, because I have three different takes on aletheia and thea. Thanks to recent discovery, I got a third one, and like having three legs, stability is achieved. All stable structures in the universe have three stable points. We discussed that earlier with Julian Barber. The most stable thing is the triangle. You don't have any stability with 2, and you get too much stability with 4. And another fantastic thing with the triangle, which makes it the safest, strongest, most permeable thing in the universe, is that it's scale independent. It can read off scale from its inner doing. And here you will see a connection. I will add the triangular momentum to the whole thing, calling for stability. The three different subjects where I will gain this stability is from quantum mechanics. It is from Mandelbrot, fractality, chaos theory, and the third one is topology of thinking. This is how space enters. Space is no longer, I would say, I step my foot down, space is not the domain of architects, geologists, and so forth, and we others have to make do with Newtonian three-dimensional space. No, we need to recapture space and see what incredible benefits it can give. So these are the three legs of today's lecture. My first proposal to put Heidegger's concept of thea and aletheia into sound scientific foundation. The three people who will represent, they are only representative, there are loads more. But when it comes to space, it's Stephen M Rosen. When it comes to all the interesting things, when it comes to Mandelbrot set, fractality, Julia sets, Minkowski space, and the Feigenbaum number, and so forth, it is Jude, Currivan. When it comes to quantum mechanics, my homage goes to Arkady Plotnitsky, and it's a marvel that we actually went through Arkady Plotnitsky very carefully, and how he showed the connection between chaos theory, quantum mechanics, and Derridian deconstruction. So we had before 2 legs, we now have 3 legs. The tripod, or think of it also as Agia Triada, the Holy Trinity. It is no coincidence that 3 makes the most stable thing. And I've already seen here in the Klein bottle that there are also 3 things available. Part uncontained, which is in Ryans, who's a helper of Stephen M. Rosen, is the subject side. Part contained, it's the object side. Part containing, which is space, is the third thing, the third leg of the tripod. I will start where I ended at 1122. Coincidentally, the camera gave up. It might be a repetition, but I think in that case it serves as a start to going into the comparison with fractality and Mandelbrot sets. To perceive, Stephen M. Rosen writes on page 31 in Body of Paradox. Etymologically, to perceive is to take hold of or take through. From the Latin per, through, and capere, to take. And to conceive is to gather or take in. It is through perceptual and or conceptual activity that we work with the ordinary simple contained text. The term proprioceive is from the Latin proprius, meaning one's own. Literally then, proprioception means taking one's own, which can be read as taking of self or self-taking. The term finds its most common usage in physiology, where it signifies an organism's sensitivity to activity in its own muscles, joints and tendons. Proprioception we spoke a lot about in 500-600, and then it was the Alexander technique, especially here James Green, I think it was, I was also in contact with an English Alexander teacher. Bohm saw this as a meditative act in which consciousness becomes aware of its own implicate activity, going back into space from the part contained, the subject, into the object where it's situated in the part containing. There is no coincidence that the part containing has the inflection gerund. It's a progressive thing. It's a constant happening. Years earlier, the social psychiatrist Tregal Burrow had spoken similarly of the need for human beings to gain a proprioceptive awareness of the organismic basics of their divisive symbolic activity. What I'm proposing here is that proprioception is the appropriate way to work with the Klein bottle, and that it is what the self-containing Klein bottle requires and invites. In thinking this Kleinian text, that is the text of Stephen M. Rosen, we must think proprioceptively, think our own thinking. In my sense of the term, proprioception would not entail a realization of the self that cleanly transcends, this is important, transcends all symbolic operations. It would not lead to a state of pure consciousness, in which all relations to objects are left behind, like the prajnic meditation, the prajna we mentioned before, practiced in the southern school of Chinese Zen. Kleinian proprioception would not just involve sheer non-discrimination, but non-discriminating discrimination. So we will still have discrimination but in an indiscriminative way. We will not lose our sharpness, our concepts, our way of cutting through blurriness. The necessary whole, this is important, it's situated here. Here is the whole. It's where it goes into the part containing. That whole and this whole makes possible wholeness. This is exactly as Rodolphe Gachet meant by avoidance or staying free or stirring free from nullification. Nullification is the direct mirroring that obliterates both object and subject. And I would say that is the classical method. Nothing remains. And the consequences of that was, of course, modernism and then postmodernism that denies both subject and object. The necessary whole in our Kleinian text calls neither for a continuation of symbolic meditation by itself, nor for the meditative immediacy of pure experience. Rather, it invites what we may call meditation or mediation. There is a T put in parentheses in the middle of the word. It could mean both. The mutual permeation of externally mediated activity, like objects doing, the life, conceptual intellectualization, and at the same time internal self-realization, or the reflectivity and the pre-reflective. Thus, our proprioception would not be a pure self-thinking, but a thinking of others that flows right through the whole in the Kleinian other and back to itself. Only in such a process would we not simply be seeking to break away from symbolic reflection. Could we truly surmount its pervasive influence, and while the symbolic would no longer reign supreme, through Kleinian proprioception, it actually would reach culmination, for no longer would the symbol conceal the pre-symbolic ground that sustains it, so as to maintain the false impression of being complete unto itself. It is this complete identification that Gachet writes about. And I think most writers and philosophers of time since the Greeks are indirectly always achieving. And that is the true identification where the subject is exactly as the same as what it observes, which leads to a multitude of problems. This is the key out of that. I'm so sorry I don't have a Kleinian bottle with me. I promise you tomorrow I will have one. But it is necessary. It needs to be felt, seen, and experienced. That is very important. And this is also what Stephen M Rosen means when he talks about proprioceptive. Needs to be felt, done. And while the symbolic would no longer reign supreme, through Kleinian proprioception it actually would reach culmination. For no longer would the symbol conceal the pre-symbolic ground that sustains it, so as to maintain the false impression of being complete unto itself. Remember Saussure, his incredible problem with signified and signifier that never ends, and infinite regress, torture I would say. in recognizing its own incompleteness as a simply autonomous entity, in acknowledging its roots in the pre-symbolic, the symbol would gain authentic completion. And here we have an exact equivalence to the sign in Heraclitus, fire. Because fire can be a sign that is true, a sign not part of what it signifies, but at the very same time is literal fire, tangible, real fire. That is the solution to the Heraclitean problem. There should be a Kleinian bottle at the end of each Heraclitus translation. The Kleinian symbol would bring the symbolic to fruition by bringing to light the aspect of that previously had gone unsymbolized. Put it in alchemical terms, the inside-out Kleinian vessel would be bene clausum, hermetically sealed. Not only entirely open to its own pre-reflective source, but because of this very openness, also entirely closed, complete unto itself. So it allows for completion hermeneutically, but I also would like to say hermeneutically sealed, but still participating in the world, because its openness is still there. It's sealed, but still open. So, rounding up here with the last little paragraph of Stephen M. Rosen, his conclusion to this rather marvelous short article. In making wholeness a concrete reality, we are to read this text proprioceptively. Read our own reading. Read those words about passing beyond themselves into their pre-linguistic roots in such a way that the passage actually takes place. To mediate such a reading, I have fleshed out this paradoxical text by dimensionally amplifying it via the Klein bottle. Now the body in our text does not consist merely of lifeless empty symbols, intrinsically meaningless signifiers, saussure, that can only point outside themselves to a disembodied meaning, what Derrida would call difference, continually progressing, never stopping. Our text is, however, the Klein bottle. It is in reading the whole, which is double W and H. It's the whole, but it's also what the whole makes possible, wholeness. In this self-containing, three-dimensional text that we should pass unbrokenly into its fourth-dimensional subtext. The Klein bottle's incompleteness, when read classically, is at once an incompleteness in our symbolizing of it. In accepting the invitation to proprioception the Kleinian text, we complete our symbolic activity by circling back into its pre-symbolic origin. We can also compare that with Barbara Tversky. After the carvings in the cave, making bisons and hunters and trees, there is a decontextualization, and then we have a recontextualization. Normally, it is thought by a Gestalt that that process leaves the pre-reflective, the real experience of the Neolithic man, and says goodbye to that. We can never return. This is not the case. We can have the pre-reflective and the reflective. We can take apart, we can recontextualize, we can also conceptualize, intellectualize, but we don't destroy anything. We don't have to follow the motto of Rousseau, back to the wilderness, back to the preconceptual. Then we were pure. No longer necessary. But all habits indeed die hard. Can we read our own reading? Can we read the hole in the Klein bottle in such a way that we relax the compulsion to regard it as merely a hole, a gap in the ordinary object simply contained in space? There is a clue here, and that clue is compare what I just said and what Stephen M Rosen is writing with the old concept of space being homogeneous, having no character at all, and the subject having neither space. It's like a point, singularity, almost like how we perceive the atom. It doesn't have extension, and the only thing that has extension is the object. Try to soften those things up. Here you can see that space actually has property, and space is doing a big part of the limitation. It presents border. In the old way of thinking, the only thing that can present border is the object, nothing else. Here, space itself, or the apeiron, if I'm going to be as brave as to suggest the apeiron for this business. Can we enter that dimension through proprioception? I believe it is a matter of proceeding mediatively or meditatively from both sides at once. From the mediative side of the conceptual, and from the side of experiential immediacy known as meditation. Pre-reflective and reflective at the same time. Something I thought until recently. I wanted to defend it, but I couldn't describe it. I didn't have a scientific argument, because I always thought space to be the area, the domain of others. I now realize it comes to our aid, our healing aid. It is possible, because the true boundary of our symbolic activity must be paradoxical. A boundary that is not a boundary, lest we continue in the boundary-making mode of the symbolic. It is precisely at this inner horizon that the conceptual and the experiential can flow into one another without interruption. This is why containing has the gerund. It's a process. It is here that we can realize the intimate harmony of language and silence, of outside and inside. I shouldn't point this because inside and outside are both in here. It is not the harmony of prajna, the paradoxical WHO wholeness of the finite and the infinite intimated in the Southern School of Chinese Zen. Well, it could well be. So that is one leg. And I will venture into the other leg, and this is going to be slightly more complicated. But I erased all mathematical concepts, and I will present it from a Kleinian Heideggerian conceptual basis. Make a little summary of Jude Currivan's. Few years before Mandelbrot was born, two French mathematicians, Gaston Julian and Pierre Fatou, sought to map out the complex plane by undertaking a series of iterations. Iterations, isn't that grand? Mathematical processes of progressive change. The Frenchmen found in their analysis the deep ordering of attractors. Attractors are the stable things, or in the middle of a planetary system or a galaxy, there is an attractor. An attractor that can be very small, but it regulates everything. It could be seen almost like a butterfly effect, but it's an attractor, and it makes these absolutely beautiful patterns. Please go down to YouTube or Google image to check those out. They are astonishing beautifully. Poor Gaston and Julia and Pierre Fatou could never seen those because they were born way before the time of computer. But still, they had very, very good intuition about these things being possible. And this deep ordering, which is very important. Me and Henrik looked yesterday communally, not together in real life, at a videotape of the Mandelbrot set where you can zoom in and you can zoom out. And when you look down, as you actually feel being down, it could be both scaling up and scaling down. And I was just so fascinated by that. This is true up and down, not dependent on scale, not dependent on something outside. And in that way, it's very particular and parallel to the Kleinian bottle. It has a true inside and true outside, not dependent on an outside conception of what outside and inside is. And therefore, it also have a true up. But do look into those Mandelbrot sets. They're absolutely fascinating. These are naturally arising points in the complex plane that attracted surrounding points to them. The complex plane is close to this as well. The complex plane is the totality of everything that is real and everything that is unreal. I kid you not. This is what the complex plane is. I was a bit fascinated when I entered the complex plane for the first time in high school, but I never got any answers. But it is actually what it is. So you see, mythical thing, mythos, has been doing their work in mathematics, technology, or in my case, electronics, for at least 70, 80 years. And this plane is truly unreal. It doesn't get any more unreal. I would say even a ghost entering here would be much more real than the complex plane. This is one of those gems or hidden secrets of mathematics.
So it's a little bit like imagine the numbers that Stephen Mangold mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it is exactly that. It's exactly that.
So when people say that ghosts or trolls or something is not real, because the image numbers are much more unreal and people work with them or something like that.
Yeah, please ask Stefan Mangold the level of unreality with imaginary number, and he would say they are much more unreal than anything that you can fantasize about. Much more unreal. Very good question. The boundaries around the catchment areas of the attractors, this is the ones that's sucking in to make a structure. So they are constructed from a midpoint. A midpoint that is middle by itself, not middle from the outside. Why is it so? Well, everything gets constructed. Time, space, and information starts with that middle point. It's the organizing principle. I think you can see now how much stronger this is than the usual origo that most people have to make do with. This is inner centrality, inner organization. You get your own inner map, but it's not a borrowed thing from a map factory. You don't contact Generalstaben, as it's called here in Sweden, and ask for a map of your own territory. This map is truly from the inside. And if somebody would ask Stefan Mangel, what is the foundation of the imaginary numbers? The good thing is actually just that. They are not founded on something outside of them. This is the good thing. Because everything that is founded on something outside will be weaker. Think of the Gödelian theory, showing that an outside proof of something makes it weaker. It makes it either inconsistent or incoherent, and you don't know which. They still had the revelation, we're talking 3-4 decades before the advent of computers, and they enable Julia and Fatou to put the Julia sets into, they came to be known as Julia sets, into exquisite detail. The two men never saw the computer representation, but they understood it. They didn't have it tangible, but they intuited the whole thing, which I think in itself is rather marvelous. And it's also important because they put the development 50 years ahead. They started before computers. Possibly, and that's an interesting thing which struck me, if they were to be born in the area of computer, they might not have gone so far, because being able to compute something in a way limit everything. Once you see it, this is the lesson for the Klein bottle, once you see it, you make it reflective, you make it tangible, you make an object of it. It's harder to move. It will be there, it will be out there, and that will limit the whole thing. That sort of limit is avoided by the Klein bottle. What they discovered, though, would be instrumental for Mandelbrot's later work. That was in the computer era. And how such fractal attractors apply to apparently chaotic and complex systems. Another critical contributor to Mandelbrot's discoveries was American mathematical physicist Feigenbaum, who also investigated the natures of iteration. And now the interesting thing comes. He wanted to understand how it was possible that when a system with a lot of variables, when they passed a certain threshold, a step, entire system undergoes bifurcation or branching. This is the same branching as here. The more sensitive a system is to certain variable increases its responses is the feedback, and leads to further bifurcation with each branch itself splitting into further two. Unless halted in some way, the rate of the continued doubling of the splitting approaches ever closer to a single point, and this is called the Feigenbaum point, and where the system enters a chaotic state. Vitally though, even with the chaos are areas of order that can become the fractal seeds of an emergent new stability, as you will see soon here. Feigenbaum found that the ratios between successive bifurcations convert to a specific number, 4.6692016. A constant point. Regardless of whatever systems are studied. It goes for all systems. It doesn't matter if you try to study the income level situation in Uganda, the height of chickens in India, or the shape of stones in some beach in Florida. doesn't matter. It always goes to the same number. And this is the first clue of what a singular chapter is. We normally think this is the university library, and there are a lot of institutions. None of these institutions think that they are all ruled by a specific number. They don't think that. That's not part of general understanding. But it is so. This is how it is. When it reaches a certain complexity, an order evolves. And that order doesn't have a foundation. It's unfounded. Therefore, so much stronger. And I think in all the other, I'm exaggerating here to make a point, but also try to help you. All the institutions here, all 40, 50 of them, all of them want to found their knowledge of something external. And according to chaos theory, that will weaken. That will be the same as we mentioned before with the voice of the friend. Trying to found the voice of the friend. I mean, found like foundation. To say, my friend is Michael or Anna or something like that. Or it's a singular voice. It's not the plural voice. Or it has the origin of being in that location. This classical theory, of course. All those things will weaken considerably. Here we have a stability from inside. You're no longer leaning on something. You see now why I wanted to have the tripod, because it doesn't have to lean on anything. Most structures that we built until, let's see, the 1940s, they all relied on an external support. But after Buckminster Fuller, we started to understand that inner stability, not leaning on anything, having the tripod-like thing or this-like thing, that causes much bigger stability. Goes for argument, goes for knowledge. Knowledge, specifically knowledge. Knowledge founded on something outside is no longer the tripod, it is no longer the Klein bottle, it will be weakened, it will be distant. Like pi, another never-ending, never-repeating irrational number. Feigenbaum's number is a truly universal constant of our universe. His understanding, however, emerged from studies concerning and solely measuring real number. It was only when Mandelbrot used the power of computer analysis to combine the understanding of attractors and Julia sets with the extension of Feigenbaum's insight to the complex plane, which I mentioned before, that a vastly greater and even more profound picture emerged. Mandelbrot was aware that Julia and Fatou had discovered two types of fractal Julia sets. Listen now, one is made of completely disconnected groups and the other of completely connected ones. He wanted to understand the deeper pattern that caused the two types, and here you see them. The pattern he wanted to discover is this one, the fractality, so to speak, the border. In 1980, he decided to map the mapping by coloring in points from which arose connected Julia sets and leaving blank the points from which disconnected sets emerged, thereby constructing a boundary. This identified all connected and all disconnected Julia sets in what became a single largest set, now famous and named after Mandelbrot. For what came out of the computer was as utterly unexpected as it was wonderful. The inside and outside of the geometrical Mandelbrot set was the boundary between all connected Julia sets inside and all disconnected Julia sets outside. It's the boundary of Mandelbrot set, though that's truly extraordinary, and that marks the embedded Julia sets as being exactly on the cusp here between connection and disconnection. It's here where zooming in at the smaller and smaller scales reveals even smaller and smaller embedded Julia sets. Mandelbrot had literally discovered fractal harmonics of creation. What they opened the doorway to was a realization that all physical complex and chaotic systems are based on underlying and this is important, non-physical complex plane attractors. Why is this so important? Well, I would say all the institutions here try to base everything on something external, what they think the physikos, or the natural world. They are pointing towards it. This is why we have signified and signifier. It points to something, and thereby creating a distance. Here we have an antidote to this. The underlying thing of this, it's not physical. What governs it, what has all the relevant properties of it, it's not of the standard physical nature. And since it covers all of knowledge, all the institutions, this is what Julia sets are. They cover all propositions, all sayings, all facts, whether they are connected or unconnected. This is nothing less than a complementarity. They are as dissimilar as can be, the disconnected and the connected Julia sets. But interestingly enough, in the very border, something that Jude Currivan calls holographic boundary, and I just call it the frontier, everything lies. This is the movement. This is where Thea and Aletheia meet. And this is the important thing. It contains everything. And how does it contain everything? Well, it has all of information, but it has also have all of not information. It has both. This is complementarity in knowledge. Before we had complementarity in time and space, now we have it in knowledge as well. Knowledge works in this way. And this has a movement. This is why we call it part containing. It has the gerund. Because there is a movement implied here. It's a happening. It's no standstill. We are all the time reflecting, all the time seeing, understanding, thinking, but we can remain pre-reflective, stand still, without moving. There is no longer this horrendous paradox between movement and non-movement. They can both be present. And we don't have to give up one of them. We can have both, which is actually important. Because this is what this is saying. And this comes from the very start to accept the complex plane with imaginary numbers or imaginary information, mythos, and real information, truths, logos or ratio. Here is logos, here is mythos. And what used to be myth is today logos. You see how there is a movement here. And that by clinging on to this, like the classicals, makes problems. Clinging on to this, like the postmodernists, makes problems. Here we have steadiness and movement. Here we can have change without having to do revolutions all the time. Here we can have progression without me having to change my mind every day. This would stir us away from the destiny of Bertrand Russell, changing on philosophical indications at least 18 times. And I would say, and this is very hopeful, I just put this in parentheses, this also shows that all of language trying to explain something can be enormously simplified. Why is that? Well, we can make it to mean whatever we want to, as long as we understand how this works. The more we understand the working of this, the more we can do the way by Heraclitus, using simple metaphors like fire, water, war and peace, men and slaves, all that will be possible. And this is also a hopeful thing for our project, simplification and going down to the level of ordinary people. And this is also something that will connect to a previous lecture I had many times before, and that's the golden measure. I always thought the golden measure to be something extra, something that was put upon the normal world. Was greatly admired by Leonardo da Vinci, and many people use it. Still to this day, the golden measure is used to make credit cards or tickets. But the golden measure is actually foundational. It is something that is very stable. It's close to the tripod, but it works differently. Keep to the golden measure, and your arguments and your thinking will be strengthened. The golden measure doesn't have a founding in the natural world, but it makes it stronger. It's no longer pointing to the outward. It's pointing to the inside and the outside at the same time, and thereby encompassing both to the biggest possible strength. So this puts Heidegger into a scientific realm. All those who had conundrums about this, and there's a lot of people I talked to before says, alatea, that's a very interesting metaphor. By saying a metaphor, they imply, well, it's pointing to the physikos, and it's a special take of the physikos, special take of existence and non-existence. Here we can show that not to be the case. It's foundational. Alatea is foundational in fractals, so also in topology, geometry, space. And that's a space that should be reconquered by us. That space should be given back to us. So we understand that our subject, our souls, our reflection is something that could have extension and takes space to exist. No longer do we have to have this point-like consciousness that is absolutely blank and falling into those problematic things. For instance, René Descartes, who thought his consciousness was only what he reflected. So I'm looking at the thermos, all of Hans is the thermos. And you don't have a choice. He didn't know about the Klein bottle. That was the only conclusion you can make up. No wonder people stirred away from Descartes intuitively, because that's a disaster in itself. It's not the nice point to be. And can you see how this is also similar to the attitude of Daniel Dennett? Because he says actually in the reverse format the same thing as Descartes. He says that all that is him is what he observes, the material physikos worlds as he thinks. And I'm made up of the physikos, of the atomos. And therefore the point-like becomes even more point-like. He tries to make it disappear even. And Dennett is falling onto an already established hierarchy that is so established in all thinking of the world today, and that is that consciousness is derived from the material world somehow, and therefore our thoughts are secondary to the real world. And I would say that is very similar to Descartes as well. It takes in a third factor, and it makes one not being really balanced, not being in the upright position, not sort of taking the water from the source, instead waiting a long way from the source, the pre-reflective, and getting stranded like 100 kilometers from the source, and there's a stream and it's badly polluted. Run through factories, it's run through gardens, run through acres and acres of dirt, and you drink that instead. And it's diluted. It's bound to be weak, and that weakness makes you go the way I did before. I might do it again, I hope not, but the Bertrand Russell way. You define yourself only in contrast to what is outside. And although at the moment I'm putting my foot down and I say I am not Daniel Dennett, it sounds very strong, but it causes a dependency. It makes Daniel Dennett a supplement of myself. This is pointing to a greater stability. And this was the gift of Heidegger, and in a future lecture not too far away, I will see how Heidegger also can be founded in quantum mechanics. But at least I covered 2 legs now in this lecture, and I thank you very much for your patience, and I will give posthumously praise to Gaston Julia, Pierre Fatou, but also Mitchell Feigenbaum and Benoit Mandelbrot. There are 2 other characters that come into the picture here. It's the Czech-American Capek and the Canadian thing, Ryan. Ryan is the constructor of this one, part on contain and part containing and part contained, which is especially brilliant because it has this gerundum. You see, there is a process in the stillness. But thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.